the year that Galileo's work was put on the index is the year that Descartes' Meditations appeared. And Descartes, in his subtitle to Meditations on First Philosophy, his subtitle is "In which the immortality of the soul and the existence of God is proven." And so, if that doesn't put you in the arms of the church, hey, what does? So that the arguments in the Meditations are on the grounds that this is certain knowledge about the way the world works. Then after Descartes, Spinoza says, I can do it better. I can put this in geometric form with axioms and postulates and proof theorems. And by theorem number 17, I have concluded that God necessarily exists. And so, and why that disturbed the Christians, I don't know, but his fellow Jews drove him out of town. And he went and had his, he was also wrote one of the first and best treatises on tolerance. But following him came a guy named Leibniz, who is responsible. How many of you have taken a calculus course? Anybody here taken a calculus course? You've heard of calculus, right? It has this fascination notion that there is something called the instantaneous rate of change. And so what you're looking for is what at this moment is the rate of change, that because at this moment there is no change, right? Because at this moment there is no passage through time. And so the very notion of an instantaneous rate of change was something that was quite revolutionary. And Newton maintained that he thought this up, and that Leibniz was a liar. Leibniz was more magnanimous than Newton. But if you ever take the calculus course, the notation that you use is Leibniz's notation. And so, what was his interest in this? Well, he wanted to maintain that if there was an instantaneous rate of change, then there was something going on at an instant that was activity without endurance through time. And this developed into what he called a monad, and his monadology became the basis for a rational conception of the world, in which it's all right for the physicists to go off and do the stuff that Newton does, but the metaphysics is of this sort, and the basis for that is what happens in mathematics. So the conviction of this rationalist tradition is that you can learn about the nature of the world through rational discovery. Okay? And a contemporary of everybody thinks of Leibniz as 17th century and John Locke as 18th century. But John Locke died in 1704, and at that time, Leibniz was going to publish a response to his John Locke's treatise on human understanding, and out of respect for John Locke, he didn't publish the. Leibniz outlived John Locke, although John Locke's philosophy became the dominant one in the 18th century. And John Locke, some people in intellectual history say the 18th century is the century of Locke and Newton, because Newton's developments in physical science and John Locke's development in the nature of human knowledge were pervaded the things that followed. John Locke said all our knowledge comes from experience, and the mind is a blank tablet on which experience writes, and all that sounds very groovy and poetic, but John Locke cheated a lot and imported stuff about substances as that which underlies the qualities that you experience and so on. And so the successors to John Locke were critically aware that his thesis about experience was not carried out in his analysis of the way that knowledge works. In between Locke and David Hume comes George Berkeley, who will meet in a week or two, who wanted to maintain that if you start out with all knowledge is from experience, you wind up with no knowledge of material reality. And so we can conceive of the world as all a world of ideas, and it's sustained in the mind of God, which is really wild, and that's what you'd think today too, if Jonathan Edwards hadn't died of smallpox when he took over being president of Princeton. It was called New Jersey College at that time. Jonathan Edwards was a Bible-pounding preacher, but he was also a scholar who was dealing with putting Berkeley's epistemology together with Newtonian science. And when Jonathan Edwards couldn't be president of New Jersey College, they imported this guy from Scotland who was not an idealist, but a critical common sense philosopher. And so Witherspoon taught the fathers of your country, and the tradition of common sense philosophy evolved into American pragmatism, which is what you inherit today. Now, that's all your cultural history, and that's just a thumbnail sketch. But the root of it is that these guys in the earlier times were dealing with problems that generated revisions in people's way of thinking about things. And some of those revisions seem to be an advancement. Others of them seem to be another fly in the ointment of human reflection. David Hume, big disappointment in the treatise is that it didn't sell. David Hume, you probably will never in your lifetime hear anybody talk about David Hume's monumental history of England, but it was unless you're doing philosophy history, it transformed the way people did history. And he was able to do that because he was appointed as the librarian of the Advocates Library, which is now the National Library of Scotland. In those times, especially in Scotland, where in wintertime the sun comes up at 10:30 and goes down at 3:30, you don't have a lot of time in the library because they don't have electric lights. And if you ever go, has anybody ever been to the British Library or have you ever been to the British Museum in London? You have. In the middle of the British Museum, it is a circular room that is lighted by a skylight. And one day, that used to be where the British Library was. They moved to New Digs, which is pretty fancy across the street. But the skylight was so that you could see to read because there were no electric lights. And one day when 20th century scholars were in there working and all the lights went out, you came to appreciate what difference that makes. And so David Hume was able to write a 10-volume history of England that wasn't just an account of succession of kings and wars. That is, it was a cultural history, and it transformed the way people thought about doing historiography. So that's where he made his money, and he moved to Newtown in Edinburgh and gave big dinner parties on Friday nights to his friends like Adam Smith, who came over from Glasgow. I hope I'm still a little entertaining and haven't put you to sleep quite yet. But I do all of this because it generates context for why certain kinds of things are being talked about because of what's already been done. And what David Hume is really concerned with is this part of the treatise on the nation. He wants to set up this part and this part to get you to new understandings about the way in which morality works. So he happens to be much more famous for this part than he does for those parts, which again makes him, he said that his treatise fell stillborn from the press because it didn't sell well. So being an enterprising fellow, he went and wrote the Inquiry for Human Understanding, which is what I asked you to read a piece of today. And I'm assuming you didn't read it. Is that fair enough? Has anybody read anything? Well, I care. I have a whole library at home. I have a whole library at home that is full of books that I've never read. And students used to come into my office at the university and look around and would be gobsmacked at all these wonderful, how smart I must be because I have all those books, which was always embarrassing, but I didn't always tell them. Anyway, so you've got the long version, and the rest of us are going to do the short version, and I'm going to do it, I hope, fairly quickly before you go to sleep, but to ensure that there'll be more than you and me that are able to talk about this next time when we go to when we go to see how what David Hume does is influencing. You'll come back. And so, right at the outset, yes, sir.
What was the title The reading?
The title is Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. No, yeah, Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, abridged. He and I dealt with the longer version, which has got all these. You
read the longer version too.
What was your thought?
But I should have read the abridged version.
Yeah, because all of those asides about what these guys do and those guys do, not interesting to you at all. Well, that's right. You're in a much more
Information rich.
yeah. David Hume's time. If you ever read Ivanhoe, anybody ever read Ivanhoe? Is one of one of the series that's called. Nobody knew how that Sir Walter Scott wrote Ivanhoe. He wrote a book. He was famous as a poet. He wrote a book called Waverley, and then he wrote a whole series of romantic stories. And so they were all noted as by the author of Waverley. And for a long time, nobody knew that he was the author. But when I first read Ivanhoe when I was in high school, I was really distressed that the first 30 pages said nothing about the story. It went on about how the leaves were beautiful and all that other crap, okay? And it's amazing that I got through the first 30 pages and I said to myself, why in the world is this guy doing this? And the answer is he got paid by the page or the words. And so the more words you got, because people sitting at home, I mean, got nothing else to do because they got no, they don't even have electric lights, much less radio and TV and internet. These were pastimes. So Hume starts out with all this stuff about moral philosophy. Now, moral philosophy with Hume doesn't mean what you ought to do when you are out of church. Moral philosophy has to do with those features of human existence that are not a part of what's called natural philosophy, which is physical science. And so natural philosophy is that's what Isaac Newton did. But moral philosophy is what Locke and Berkeley and Hume did. And so he says the first kind is the people who pay attention to sentiment and inspire you to live a certain way. The second species is focusing on the reasonable as opposed to the active. And so, while they attempt this arduous task, they are determined by no difficulties, but proceed from particular instances to general principles. They still push on their inquiries to principles more general and rest not satisfied until they arrive at those original principles by which, in every science, all human curiosity must be bounded. Though their speculations seem abstract, even unintelligible to you and me, they aim at the approbation of the learned and the wise. And so, it's certainly easy and obvious philosophy will always, with the generality of mankind, have the preference above the accurate and the abstruse. but we're gonna go for the act. And so, this obscurity and the profound and abstract philosophy is objected to, not the least fatiguing, as a source of uncertainty and error. So, but after all, the abstractness of these speculations is no recommendation, but rather a disadvantage to them. And as this difficulty may perhaps be surmounted with care and art, and avoiding all unnecessary detail, we have in the following inquiry attempted to throw some light upon subjects from which